Welcome back, Ronnie. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Anika.
It's been a while. So the last time we had, you and I had a dialogue around multiculturalism to transculturalism. And seems like the world is regressing at the moment on every front, politically, culturally, on societal, systems are failing. The failure of nation state and all that you and I were talking about, and seems like the empire is coming back like it used to be, and you have something to say around that. So I thought, why not have a dialogue with you, because you've spent a lot of time in the MENA region working with quite distinctive organizations and people of stature there, like especially from Jordan, Haifa Najjar, the senator. So you have a stake in that game as well, so to speak. So how do you see? Do you think, how do we get out of this? Is there a way out? Because talking about the age of integrality, which you've been working on for about more than 30 years, where do you see yourself or integrality? Is it going to work? Sorry, so many questions. I'm just offloading my thoughts onto you, so you can take it from in whatever direction. Yeah.
So let's start from where you've left off, Anika, with the notion of integrality and, in a sense, where the potential lies, but where we're actually massively missing the point. If you take the notion of integrality as a kind of philosophical, psychological movement with people like Ken Wilber having led the way, what to me is missing is, how does that translate itself into a world of a multiplicity of cultures, which is what we have in the world today? Because although integrality is originally actually comes from Soloviev in Russia in the 19th century, today it's very influenced by Wilber in America as a kind of universalistic notion. And to me, that completely misses the point, because to the extent that we've moved into an age of integrality, it's an age where we recognize not only the existence of multiple cultures, but much more important, Anika, is the actual interaction between and the fusion amongst those cultures. And there is virtually nothing on the world map institutionally to encourage that. And now I'll come down to the, if you like, the nub of the matter. If we look at what's happening in Israel, Palestine, on the one hand, and Ukraine, Russia on the other, is we have this totally dysfunctional United Nations, which is still an embodiment of the 18th century notion of the nation state. The United Nations is just multiple nations. There's nothing international or transnational or transcultural about it. And the result of that is that if you have two different parties, cultures, polities, Russia and Ukraine, or Israel and Palestine, the UN is totally impotent and incapable of doing anything about it. And by that, I mean not only in the here and now, obviously, but much more historically and in anticipation of the here and now. The kind of uniting nations that we should have between us should be enabled to actually forestall and prevent the kind of disasters we see amongst us. And alongside that, and I'll finish this part of the conversation by distinguishing the geopolitical from the what we call the generative. Alongside that, the very notion that Russia or China or America should be a sovereign nation state with its own president voted by its own people, to me is absolutely crazy, because these so-called nation states are actually wrecking the world, right? While at the same time, to some degree, they're actually enhancing the world. But they are worldly, right? And they are nothing sovereign. This is a total misconception. And the problem, Anika, is the world just hasn't woken up to this, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the distinction between what we call the geopolitical, which is the powers of the political, the economic, and the military, which far overshadow what we call the generative, which is the powers of nature and culture, that these two realms are separated from each other. The one is nice to have. We have beautiful monuments, we have beautiful singers, and so forth. But they are totally in the shadows compared to the power of a Putin or a Xi Jinping or a Donald Trump and what they actually represent. So this division between the geopolitical and the generative, this disintegration of the integral and integrality because of that very division, the false notion of the nation state as having any prospect of safeguarding our future, all of these things kind of come together into a kind of nonsense world. And the result is we look at the tragic images on our televisions today and think it's all about Israel or Palestine. And for me, that is a total misconception of the nature of the world. It's all about the world as a whole and the dysfunctionality of the world as a whole. Final point, and then let's pause. While I'm talking very much as a macro level, as you know, Anika, at a micro level, I come back to our notion of the communiversity. Unless you have groups of thinkers around the world conceiving of these alternatives, our research academy, experimental laboratories, politically and economically, who are actually working with these alternatives, trying and testing them out, people on transformation journeys who are taking their own journey personally and collectively into the future, as well as learning communities building up new propositions. This macro conversation will get us nowhere.
Mm. Thank you for that. But I'm going to pick 2 points from what you've said. A, you're saying the world needs to wake up. And I would say, I see the people are waking up and coming together. Now, this leads to my second point, what you've said about the macro level. And on the micro level, intellectuals and people like us need to come together institutionally, and then maybe we can overturn the system. But that hasn't happened, Ronnie. History stands witness to there are umpteen, these organizations, even institutions on micro level that people like groups start, like you and I and others. There are so many, but they don't get anywhere. They fail on the macro level. There's like a roadblock. We always hit this brick wall and we can't go past that. And then we lose hope. I mean, I have witnessed so many of, my own colleagues, mavericks in their own fields. They've just put their hands up and saying, we can't do anything. It's a failed state we are in. And they're so despondent that it has actually affected me as well. But I actually take all that courage from you, because I look at you, you are like a shining example, always being very positive about it and saying, let's not criticize, let's do something about it. And we are trying to in our own little ways. But what about this macro level, this geopolitical hidden agenda that some of us eventually get, but still we are helpless and it goes nowhere?
Yeah, I mean, let me put two thoughts, and obviously you're raising a very, very complex issue, and my thoughts on that will only begin to touch that issue. But here are two thoughts. The first is that when you talk of people versus institutions, in other words, there are thousands of people doing good things, but they don't get very far. And seldom do we actually build institutions on the back of what people are doing. One of the
Yes.
main reasons for me is that the great societal institution builder in the world is not the only one, but it's the best known one, is America. The Americans are great at building institutions. In other words, as much as I might rail against an Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, it's not Mark Musk or Zuckerberg in isolation. These people will have institutions behind them, right? Zuckerberg built up Facebook. Facebook is a formidable institution. And Joseph Needleman, in his book on the American soul, makes a big point of it. He said the greatest art form that America has brought to the world is the art of institution building. The big downside is these institutions are narrowed down for their own singular purposes of the American people or part of the American people. They are not lending this institution building capacity to the world at large. I could add to that a group of people like the Scandinavians. The Scandinavians are very good at building institutions. For a time, the Japanese were very good at building manufacturing institutions. But by and large, these institution builders don't see themselves as a force to enable other societies to build institutions. So that's one major fault line. We haven't got to. The other fault line for my recent reading, and I've quoted Ibn Khaldun, who was quite a revelation, although I know his work before, but via Anthony Sattin and his book on the nomads, the extraordinary insights that came from Ibn Khaldun, who by and large not only opposed the notion of Western progress, the world being much more circular in its forms and evolution, but also brought together the freedom of movement with the freedom of conscience with the freedom of trade. So you didn't separate out free trade from freedom of conscience. They were all part of what Sattin called a nomadic outlook. Now, the point being here, Anika, is who on earth has worked on evolving Khaldun's thinking from the 14th century to the 21st? If you take the parallel of an Adam Smith or Karl Marx, for all their limitations, there have been hundreds of people subsequently who have attempted, in some cases very well, evolve the thinking on classical economics in that respect. But then we come to the seminal figure of an Ibn Khaldun, nothing, right? Nobody's working on evolution. So I'm pointing at two things. The one is the institution builders are not building for the sake of the world as a whole. And secondly, we don't have the kind of what we call integral research academy, which will continually evolve the seminal thinking so that there is another foundation for all these NGOs you're talking about, rather than riding on the back of a neoliberal, freedom-loving Western world, that you have other worlds on which these somewhat isolated entities can actually build on some more solid ground.
I totally agree with you. And I know you've challenged me so many times that I need to, further develop the work of, say, Ibn Khaldun. That is in line with, I do mention his work often. And I built on Asabiya, the whole solidarity was a concept coming from there. Iqbal's brotherhood, the concept of brotherhood, Ahuat brotherhood, and then Asabiya. But then again, I'm one person. Both of us are in the same boat, that, you don't gather that clout around you, especially intellectually, and more so in my community, the Islamic or Muslim communities, because that has been my challenge forever, because people don't see value in that. So they either go all militant on Islam, which is like, oh, my religion is better than Islam says this. But then what? Okay, how do we then further develop, say, the work of Ibn Khaldun? And most of us are immigrants in a land, in a secular setting. And it's very challenging now, more so now with all the right wing, thinking now taking some precedent, saying, no, Islamists are the problem. I mean, we are lugged together in that one group. So it's risky. People just maybe look at their survival, day-to-day survival, and nobody's thinking about it. And I know that people like Sardar and Ziauddin Sardar and you and I actually said that about 10 years ago, that we need to now pull up our socks and put our act together, because something will hit us, and it's hitting us now. But still we don't see that. And you are right that people don't come together to create or build another institution, or institutionally they don't come together. I see online people are sitting there constantly, just commenting and nothing after that. And I'm so allergic to it, but I have to be part of that the flow that is, who am I? One person. So what do you say to that? I mean, who is one person? How can we then do something about it? I don't know myself.
So what you're pointing to, Anika, which is of course painful in a way to recognize, because we need to start close to home, is in our immediate environment with our colleagues and associates, we are facing the very issue that you're talking about. And just from two perspectives. The one is from a kind of functional perspectives. My colleagues, as we're building up our center in South Africa for societal regeneration, continually talk about research. And I said, yes, we'll do our research, but that's not the key. The key is what I would call catalyzation, what you're talking about, is how do you catalyze these diverse parties, included in our own midst, the different people we've been associated with the years, to actually co-create together. Now, secondly, take the example of Asabai. I can remember vividly when we were working intensively with the great Med Labs in Jordan, which were a fantastic organization. I have a profound respect for them. And when we were working on our own, developing them as an integral enterprise, I said, look, we need to start close to home. The integral enterprise was invented by Lessem and Schiffer in Europe. So what's the equivalent in your part of the world? And that's when I cited Asabiya. Well, the negative reaction I got from one or two of our colleagues there was just amazing. You can't use that, they said. That's a terrible word. And sort of we got nowhere. Never mind digging deeper into Ibn Khaldun. So the broader point, aside from the personal reaction, is that an organization like MedLabs could see itself as a catalyst for the evolution of the Near Eastern region, which frankly it doesn't. It sees itself as an economic pioneer or benchmark, but societally, yeah, so that's when things get stuck.
But do you agree also with the point that societies are now actually regressing? And I actually take into account Khaldun's work, where, yeah, it's cyclical. Dynasties always, they fail and then they rebuild themselves. That's what he was working on at that time. So I think we are in that phase of the history that we are seeing a lot of, failure, on the nation state, and also morally also societies are declining, and the political system is it's not working in any country, to be very honest. You look at Pakistan, you look at even the UK, it's a total mess. And that's why now, this is why then societies or communities become despondent or complacent. They feel like, you talk to a common man. My own daughter would say to me, why do you worry so much about the community or the society? Why can't you be a normal person like others are? And that just hits me. And I'm like, no, none of us should think that's normal. That's abnormal. We all need to, have some contribution in society building. Otherwise, you see that around, especially the UK, once a thriving economy. Now look, it's total degradation on every level. Do we have a solution? I don't have a solution. We can only propose to people if they are willing to take that.
So I think given, if you like, all these negatives you rightly point to, and we haven't even mentioned technology, which is a major factor, the whole technology fetish, which saps so much of our consciousness. But if you take the other side of the coin and back to our responsibility, and when I say our, Anika, it's not only you and I individually, but come back to the notion, which, as you know, I'm very attached to, of a communiversity, that we need to establish that ilk in that different part of the world. If you take, for example, where I've now moved to in Horsham in Southeast England, there's an absolute seminal enterprise. If you've come across the notion of rewilding, it's really the probably best known center for rewilding Knep estate in the whole of the world, and literally 5 kilometers.
Right.
So immediately I wake up and say, this is absolutely incredible. This is a real positive force in the world. What can we do with it? Now, the thing is that they will be involved with nature and rewilding. What we're involved in, is the rewilding or regeneration of societies. So immediately I'm looking for ways and means to connect that impulse with a management institute, which again is 5 kilometers away from me, which is very involved with complexity dynamics, who incidentally have never heard of the Knepp estate, which is 5 kilometers away from them. And then I discover that the whole back to land movement, which originated in the UK, in the southeast of England, as you may know, the people who actually originated that movement and the distributive movement, that in a sense, the leading light in that movement lives another 5 kilometers away from me. So what I'm saying is that in a local microcosm, you will find all of these generative elements which have the potential to overturn what we're talking about. But by and large, they don't talk to each other, right? Even the seminal
Yes.
talk to each
Yes.
other. So
Yes.
it's not enough for one Ronnie Lessem to knock on Knepp Estate's door and saying, please talk to the next door neighbor. We need an
Yes.
institution,
Yes.
a catalytic institution, which bring these elements together, which so yes.
Yeah, no, I totally get you, because that's what I have been doing all along. I remember going from the UK to Pakistan and telling people, connecting them, telling them, look, you don't know about this organization. They are doing this brilliant work. But okay, saying all that, now I'll come back to the initial, the thought you and I had about the failure of the nation state and the empire maybe making its way back as it used to be. So you sent me a note on a summary of this book you're reading. So can you just quickly touch upon that? How do you see that making a comeback now in this environment?
This is a seminal work and very inspired by Ibn Khaldun. But in a sense, it has a missing element to it. So what is seminal about is that what Sattin is doing under the label of what he calls the nomad, which we in our terms, I would identify as southeastern, as opposed to the settled, which would be more northwestern, although I think there's scope for the four worlds rather than the two. He's arguing that that nomadic southeastern way is a way forward, which the Northwest has kind of ignored. And that particular way is intrinsically transcultural. Now, the insight that he brings to bear, because I was beginning to observe that the upside of the old empires, like the Ottoman Empire, was their cultural nature. They did bring different cultures and people together, firstly. And secondly, in the rare cases of the Golden Age, the House of Wisdom, having brought them together originally through colonial military escapades, then gave birth to an extraordinary cultural and scientific flowering, which followed thereafter. So that combination of a transcultural entity, which then links, if you like, the geopolitical with the generative, is kind of seminal. Now, and as an example that hasn't been followed in any conscious way, this is the particular point. The closest to my mind, because it's close to Palestine, is the Ottoman Empire and the whole millet system in the Ottoman Empire. As you know, the millet system, where in a sense each culture or ethnic group had its own representation within the kind of whole, and that gave birth to the millet system. However, that was 15th, 16th century Ottoman Empire. And this is the point, Anika, that kind of embryonic form has not been evolved, right? It lies there in the likes of an Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And we haven't evolved it. And instead, what we've landed up with is a Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, these massively dysfunctional nation states, which on the one hand were imposed by the British and the French on the one hand, but on the other hand, the people themselves didn't wake up sufficiently consciously to evolve for themselves the next evolution. So we have in waiting this political form which hasn't been created, and the result is we're creating havoc in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but as you rightly said, the Southeast would always need the Northwestern
Yeah.
impulse as well, because institution building, we've failed. I mean, look, EU was a success story in its own time. And, they revived, they built up their nations, not nations, the whole of Europe. That was the only, I think, success story of our time, the Europe and EU, which the Arabs or the Asians haven't done that. I mean, look at those regions, India, Pakistan, Israel, Syria, all these troublesome areas, but they haven't been able to pull something together. So our hopes still lie that one day maybe, but looking at the situation, nobody's hopeful. People are not hopeful. So who's going to buy into that? The Arab leaders, I don't know. Are they the ones who can take the lead now?
Yeah. And again, I think where we have a responsibility, if we have enough insight and capacity, is if you take the example of the EU, which you rightly say is probably the closest example we have to a transnational state. Firstly, in itself, it's limited because it still is fundamentally different nations kind of working together under Brussels bureaucracy. But at least, as you say, it's probably the best example we have. However, the EU has not set itself out to enable other parts of the world
Yes.
develop
Yes.
transnational entity the way that it has done.
Yes.
That is the fault line, and where we.
It's always the opposing forces rather than, complementing, as you've been saying all along. So what message are we giving to our audience now? I think it's up to people now, are you saying? People or institutions coming together?
Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, two things. The one is very personal because I'm very aware in my own family history that the role that my own father and uncle played in the early days of building up their African trading enterprise in what was then Rhodesia, becoming Zimbabwe, was very much a fusion between, if you like, the African and the European. And together in the early days, things then went wrong, not economically, but culturally. In the early days, it was Southeast, Northwest working together. But that kind of example now has sort of disappeared from the world scene. You're all about colonization, decolonization, and so forth, black, white, etc. So at that level, we need to rekindle, those seminal elements which appeared in our own history. And secondly, I come back to between us, continue our efforts to develop the kind of communiversity, research academy, which can actually serve to bring together these different forces, because that's desperately needed in the world. And whoever is kind of listening to us
Called for
join
this. Yeah.
forces.
Yeah. Thank you. I think this was, let's keep it short and sweet, as I say. But thank you for your time and wise words.
Lovely to talk to
See
you.
you again.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Bye.